Verse. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When Christ shall come with shouts of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Then I shall bow in humble adoration and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art.
Thank you, Jimmy. We missed that last week because I certainly was not going to sing. Before I get started, Dorsey, can you text Nancy and see if she knows where the prayer list is? April left them for us, but I couldn't find them. And then you can turn to Matthew chapter 20. And this is going to be our last one. I think we'll wrap up the parables tonight. And then if it's okay with y'all, unless you have a different idea, next week we're going to start looking at different world religions and just kind of compare those and see how they fit in scripturally or not. And so we'll look at all the big ones in the world and just kind of do a comparison. So we'll start that next Wednesday night. But tonight we're in Matthew chapter 20. The parable is in verses 1 through 16. It's the workers in the vineyard. You probably read it before. You know what it says. Now, again, when we study parables, you always have to figure out why it was told. Why? I mean, that's the number one reason that you look at a parable is what occasion or what was happening that Jesus felt compelled to tell a parable. There's no nice, neat entry into this one. There's really no real nice introduction or nice formality to it. It just jumps right into it. If you look, Matthew in chapter 20, there's no lead in. The only thing we can say is it comes kind of on the heels of the story about the rich young ruler. So it's going to be a parable about self-perception, about the individual and how we perceive ourselves, really. And so just kind of a recap, last three chapters, 18, 19, 20 of Matthew. Matthew chapter 18 is a whole teaching block on discipline. And so we'll see how this progresses. So if you look at chapter 18, there's a couple of stories. The first is there's the lost sheep, the 99, one gets left, Jesus goes out, or a shepherd goes out to find the one. And then there's a teaching block in there in verses 15 through 22 about church discipline. And that's the one we talked about where Peter said to Jesus, how often should I forgive? And Jesus said 70 times 7, In other words, just it's hyperbole. Just your brother never ceases to be your brother. So chapter 18 is a whole teaching block on church discipline. Chapter 19 contains really two major teachings. Chapter 19, there is the first part is about divorce. There's a whole treatise on divorce. And then there is the parable of the rich young ruler, starting verse 16. And so if you look at chapter 20, it's on the heels of this, where Jesus is talking about the disciples' reward and the rich young ruler not really seeing what he really needs. I mean, he thought he had everything he needed, but he didn't. And so Matthew chapter 19, verse 30, look at verse 30 in chapter 19. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. That is the lead-in, really. Matthew chapter 19, verse 30 ties into this parable on the workers in the vineyard because we're talking about first and last. As a matter of fact, in the Greek, it'll say, it compares two groups of people. The hoi protoi, the first hired, or the first worker, and the hoi eskatoi, the last one's hired. And so the whole point of this is going to center around, it's going to revolve around first and last. And it's about our self-perception on being first or last. So the subject matter, if you look at verse 20, chapter 20, verse 1, for the kingdom of heaven. So the subject matter is the kingdom of heaven. That's what we're talking about here. And if you doubt that from anywhere, that's Jesus' words. And this is what Jesus said. This is the subject we're going to talk about, the kingdom of heaven. And then he's going to liken it to something. And so he says the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. Right? So kingdom of heaven, and when we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, there's a couple of implications of this. The first question we're going to ask is, what does it really mean? What is the implication of coming under the rule of the kingdom of heaven? What does that mean? What does that look like for us? When you and I become a Christian, when you and I give our heart to Jesus, what does it mean for us to come under the rule of the kingdom of heaven? And there's really in theology, there's two different ways we look at this. One is heaven proper. When we get to heaven, the glory land, by and by, we're going to get there one day. But now we have kind of a what we in theology we call a realized eschatology, a kind of a heaven on earth here. In other words, in Jesus, in the person of Jesus, the rule of heaven came down. And so you and I, as disciples of Christ, as children of God, we live under the kingship of heaven, under the rule of heaven. And so when Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like this, what he's saying is, if you want to know what it's like to be under the rule of heaven, this is what it's like. This is what it's like to really be a disciple. This is what it's really like for Christ to be in charge, for him to be the king, and for you to be the subject. And so in verse 1 he says the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner. And then he's going to describe the landowner for us. He's going to say the landowner went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. So he owns the land, he's going to go out and hire. Now, the reason he's telling this is if you look at verse 25 in chapter 19, because the disciples are going to be left with some confusion. When the disciples heard this, what did they hear? Look at what Jesus said in verse 24. Again, I say to you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus is being literal in that. He's not talking about a gate. There's a lot of people that try to explain that away and say he's talking about a needle gate that's in the temple. He's talking about a literal sewing needle, and he said it's easier for a big old camel to go through the little eye of a needle than for this rich man to go into heaven. That confused the disciples. Because when this rich young guy came up to Jesus, he said, I follow the law, I've studied the Torah, I've kept all the commandments, I've done all these things. And then Jesus said, but one thing you didn't do. There's one thing, you didn't put me first. Your riches are first. And so the rich young guy went away sorrowful. The disciples got confused. And so Jesus said, okay, let me confuse you some more. It's easier for this big camel to go through this needle eye than it is for a rich guy to go to heaven. And then the disciples were confused. Look at verse 25. When they heard this, that it's easier for the camel to go through the eye of a needle, they were very astonished and said, then who can be saved? Who can be saved then? And so, all evidence, everything that they thought, pointed to the rich young ruler. Here's a guy who kept all the law. He knew everything. He had. I mean, he was the textbook Jewish kid. He did his bar mitzvah. He went through all this stuff, and Jesus said he didn't get it. And so the disciples said, "Well, then who can be saved?" And then Jesus had to come back and say, "With you guys it's impossible. With God it's not." And so then he goes into this story. He says, "Let me tell you what it's like, because you guys don't know what it's really like to be in God's kingdom. Because God does it different. God flips the script. Everything that we think ought to happen, it's not the way it goes. Every time in the Bible where Jesus is expected to react a certain way, he does it different. There's paradoxes all through the New Testament in Jesus' life. Jesus expected to go to the Pharisees' house, but he goes to the sinner's house. That's not right. That's what the Pharisees would do. They go to the religious folks' house. And so this rich young ruler comes up. Jesus says, I know you've done all this textbook Jewish stuff, but you've missed one thing. The disciples said, this is very confusing to us, because if anybody ought to get in, it's him. Jesus said, well, let me confuse you some more. He tells about this camel and a needle's eye. They said, who can be saved? Jesus said, now let me tell you a parable about what it really means to be in the rule of heaven. It really means to be under God's rule. And so he says in verse 1, this landowner owned this vineyard, and he goes out, he's going to hire day workers. These are just day laborers. It's not contract work for months at a time. In first century Judaism, they hired day laborers. And you get a denarii a day. 1 denarius is 1 day's work. And so, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute, about the fairness of all this. And I'll tell you what the Old Testament actually says about it, that the owner of the vineyard actually did right. But so this vineyard guy, this owner, is going to go out. Let's just suppose that he's way out in the country, and he's going to go into town. And so he loads up his wagon, and he got his donkeys or whatever he's got, hitched to his wagon. He's going to go into town. And there's a bunch of folks standing around the corner, which is what they would have done. They would have all been standing around the city gate, the city hall type thing. And when the owners of the vineyards or the blacksmiths, whatever, came out for day laborers, all these people that wanted jobs would be standing out there. And so the vineyard owner came by and he just started pointing folks out. You come over. He jump in his wagon and take off. And that's how this story starts. Now look at how this continues to be. Because remember, the whole theme of this is, what is it like to be under the rule of heaven? Because in the kingdom of heaven, things are not what they seem. Things sometimes run contrary to the way we think they ought to be. So look at verse 2. When he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. So he pulls up in his wagon. He calls out these, let's say, 6 guys. He says, y'all come over here. He said, will y'all work for 1 denarii a day? Yes, we'll do it. We're desperate for work. Well, jump on, let's go. And so they haul off and go to the vineyard. And so they're working. Let's say it's 8 o'clock in the morning. He picks them up early, they go out to work. Verse 3, he went out about the 3rd hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And those, he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right, I'll give you. And so they went. And so he goes back about 3 or 4 hours later. There's still people standing there, and he says, you guys want a job? Yeah, we want a job. Well, come on, let's go. And so he hires them. Now, notice what he doesn't do, because it's going to be important a little bit later. There's no contract with these guys. With the first set of workers, he said, will you do it for 1 denarii a day? And they said, yes. So they jump on and go. The second group, he just says, whatever's right, I'll pay you. They said, fine. In other words, it's up to you. We're not going to haggle over a price or anything. We're just desperate for work. Because they're already 3 or 4 hours late getting started in the day. 3 or 4 hours late. So verse 3, again, he went about the 6th hour, about 3 hours later, and the 9th hour, 3 hours later, and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour, he went out, found others standing around, and he said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day long? So he goes early in the morning, then he goes 3 hours later, he goes 3 hours, and then he's back at 11 o'clock, and he said, you guys are still standing, you've been standing here all day long, what are you doing? I guess they're standing around gossiping or whatever. In verse 7, they said to him, because no one hired us, he said to them, you go into the vineyard too. That's the 11th hour. I mean, it's the end of the day. Verse 8, when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last group to the first. All right? There's those two words. The last group is the hoi eskatoi, the last one's hired. And then to the first group, the hoi protoi, the first one's hired. So call all the workers in, and you start paying them, beginning with the ones that came in at the 11th hour. So let's say at the 11th hour, they worked an hour, and then they're going to get paid. The ones that worked, 4 or 5 hours, they're next. The ones that worked like 6 hours, they're next. The ones that worked all day long, since 8 o'clock in the morning, they're going to get paid last. So watch the attitude of these guys. Verse 9. When those hired about the 11th hour came, each one received a denarius. That's what he gave them. What did he tell the hoi protoi, the first one's hired? He said, well, you guys do it for a denarius. They said, yeah, we'll do it for a denarius. Now the last guys who work about an hour, he brings them in, and a guy gives them a denarius. Now watch what happens, verse 10. When those hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. So the guys that work at 8 o'clock, they've been working all day long, and they see the guys been working an hour, and they give them a denarius, and they all kind of bunch up. They say, man, I can't wait to see our payday. They worked an hour, and they got this. We've been working all day long. And so when they stepped up to the payment guy, he gave them a denarius too. Because what did the landowner say to them? Will you do it for a denarius? They said, yeah, we'll do it. And so he pays them exactly what he said. Verse 11, when they received it, they grumbled at the landowner. They didn't like it. And here's what they said. Verse 12, these last men have worked only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day. But he answered and said to one of them, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what's yours and go, but I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eyes envious because I'm generous? So the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. The hoi eskatoi shall be the hoi protoi. The hoi protoi shall be the hoi eskatoi. First, last, first. Now, this whole parable is sometimes difficult to interpret, difficult to talk about because of how it turns. This parable turns on something. Honestly, even in our sensibilities in the 21st century, it offends our sense of economic fairness. Don't it to you? If you go into a factory tomorrow morning and you work for 8 hours, and some guy comes in at 5 o'clock and he works an hour, and y'all clock out at the same time, you both get the same pay for the day's work, you're going to be pretty upset about that. Because you're going to say, here I am, I worked in this hot factory all day long, this guy comes in for an hour, and he just says, I got that ain't right. That's not the way we're supposed to do this. And so this whole parable turns on this idea of economic uncertainty or economic unfairness. That's what they accuse him of. They all get together and say, you did us wrong. We thought surely when we saw them get paid, we would get more, and we didn't get more. So that's where this turns. Now, there are two economies, though. These parables have different layers. There's usually and we're going to talk about this kind of in summation. There's a reason why Jesus taught parables. There's a reason why he uses this kind of language. And it's pretty simple, really. And the stories of parables always involve something that's relatable, something that you can know. And then they involve a spiritual thing. So there's two economies that he's talking about. The first economy that we're talking about is free market priorities. The economics of the free market. You work more, you should get paid more. You work less, you get paid less. That's economic fairness. That's the way it is. That's the way we look at it. We look at this story, and I guarantee you, every one of y'all in this room, everybody's listening to me online, if I just tell you the story, everybody, their first thought is, that's not right. That's not right that that these guys get paid the same as the guy that worked all day long. That's not right. I mean, it would offend you if it happened to you. And you go to the boss and you complain and say it's not right. You know, if you'd been working for this company forever and they gave you a raise, and then you find out this guy just got hired on last week and he's making the same thing you make, and you've been there 10 years, you're going to be upset about that. You say, that's not right. That's the economy of the free market. That's the economy of our sensibilities. But here's what Jesus is really talking about. The economy of grace. This story is really about the economy of grace and how we perceive ourselves. Because remember how I set this up for you? In the kingdom of heaven, things are not what they seem. It's different. God does things different than we expect God to do. He doesn't fit in this nice little box that we can figure out. You know, he's different. And so this story turns on this sense of economics, really, for us. But Jesus is talking about grace. And they don't get it. Because this rich young ruler just came up and he said, I've done all these things. You know, and Jesus said, well, but you lack one. You didn't do one thing, the necessary thing. You know, you didn't sell all your stuff and follow me. He's not saying you can't have stuff. You know, that's not what that parable's about. He just means he needs to be the priority. And so then the disciples are like, well, who can be saved if he can't? You know, because he did everything right. And so now Jesus says, okay, the kingdom of heaven is different than what you think it is. It's not laid out like you imagine that it is. And so here's the question that I have to ask you about. Here's the question of this parable. Is the landowner an unfair guy? In this parable, is he unfair? Is it unfair to pay a guy the same wage for working an hour as you pay a guy that worked 8 hours? Is that unfair? Is he unfair? Is he guilty of economic unfairness? It's really the question of this parable. Is this guy guilty of this? Now, again, we all say, well, yeah, that's extremely unfair. But here's the question. Did he break any agreement? He didn't break anything he said. The first guys that jumped on it in the morning, he said, 1 denarius. They said, yes. What did he pay them at the end of the day? 1 denarius. He didn't break any agreement. The other guys that came on during the day, he said, I'll pay you what's right. And then they got hired, and they got paid, they got a denarius. And so the first guy says, well, you're unfair. How's he unfair? I mean, point in the story and show me where he's unfair. He didn't do anything contrary to what he told those first guys he was going to do. He didn't say, I'll give you a denarius, and at the end of the day, give him a shekel. He didn't do that. He said, I'll give you exactly what we agreed on. There's only one agreement that he made, and that's in verse 2. Now, did he give them a fair day's wage? Yeah, a denarius. That's a common day wage for a day laborer. That's what they give. 1 denarius common. Did he care about his employees? Yeah, cared about them because he paid them. Listen to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. In other words, pay them at the end of the day. What he did, pay them at the end of the day. So he cared about them. He said, will you do this for a denarius? They said, yes. At the end of the day, he gave them a denarius. He didn't say, come back tomorrow or next week or that kind of stuff. Ain't it crazy how we do it now that all our paychecks are weekly or bi-weekly or monthly or whatever? Don't you want to get paid at the end of every day? You know, you work and then you get a check at the end of the day. That's what they did. And so he's fair. He's doing exactly what he said. And so here's what I'm telling you. The charge of unfairness is a matter of perspective. Because if you're the first guy hired, man, this dude's unfair. If you're the last guy hired, this is the most fair man I've ever seen. I mean, I only worked for an hour and he paid me the same thing. It's all a matter of perspective. From the perspective of the ones hired first, the ones hired last, it all changes. The ones hired first see evil in the landlord or landowner. The ones hired last see grace in the landowner. They see something different. You see things completely different from them. And so, again, the fundamental contrast in the story is between those who were hired first the hoi protoi, and those who are hired last, the hoi eschaton. The whole parable centers around the conflict or the comparison between those two. All right? So what does that mean for us? I mean, why is this in here? What does it got to do with it? This whole parable is a perspective of ourselves. It's about us. It's about where we're at. And when I say this, it's hard to pinpoint examples, especially in this church, because I don't think we do this. But here's what this is about. It's a perspective about yourself. How do churches welcome newcomers? How do churches welcome people that are brand new? A church, rural churches like Spring Creek, rural churches like Antioch, where I was at before, there was those rural churches, been there forever. There are people that belong to those churches, been belonging to them for a long time. They've been members for a long time. And their grandparents were members, their great-grandparents were members, and some of their great-great-grandparents founded the church. They've been there a long time. And it's easy for us in local churches, in God's church, in the kingdom, it's easy for us to think that we have a privileged status because we've been Christian longer, because we've been members of a church longer. It's easier for us to say, well, I should get all the benefits or the breaks or the good perks and all the newcomers are newcomers. They just got here. That's really the nuts and bolts of this thing. So it's a perspective about ourselves. Do we welcome new folks, or do we begrudge them because they reap the benefits of all the work that we put into it? Let me give you an example, a very personal example between me and this church. I didn't drive one nail in this church. I didn't hang one shingle. I didn't hang one piece of sheetrock. I didn't do anything. When this church called me as pastor, the search committee called and said, come and meet with us, 2636 Julio Road, whatever night it was, and I had no idea where this church was at. I put in my GPS, but this was just 5 years ago, but I had one of them Garmin GPS, mounted on the window. I put it in, and it brought me right to this church. I looked at this church, and I said, man, this is fantastic, this is a great church. It's on this hill, it's in a great location, it's a beautiful church, great facilities. I mean, that was my first thought. Now, once this church called me to be pastor here, I'm brand new. I didn't do any work on this place, but I reaped the benefits of those who did. There's a lot of people put a lot of sweat and work into building this church. I was not one of them. But they welcomed me here. You guys did. And I should say you guys did, because you guys, most of y'all are new like me. But you could have begrudged. I mean, there's a lot of people who could begrudge that. Like, well, you didn't do anything. You didn't help. You didn't build anything. This is our place. You didn't do it. But that's not the case. There's some churches where it's like that, where people put a lot of time and work and invest in the church and the kingdom, and then they feel like they have kind of a privileged status because they've done all these things. Here's where Jesus says, that's not the way the kingdom of heaven operates. It's not about first and last. Well, it is, because the first will be last, the last will be first. I'm going to flip it on you. I'm going to reverse it, because in the kingdom of heaven, things are not what they seem. And so it's really a matter of our self. Let me just dial this down a little. I'm trying to say this tactfully. What's our vision for outreach for this church? What's our outreach like? To be honest with you, we have an Easter egg thing every year, and we have a lot of people show up. Parking lots covered with people, kids hunting eggs all over the place, eating hot dogs, cupcakes, all that stuff. every now and then somebody will come back and see us on Sunday morning, but very rarely do they do that. You know, we give them a tract about the church, we give them information about Jesus, we talk to them, you know, walk around, and at least I do. I walk around, try to talk to some of the visitors and see if they go to church and ask them, I try to talk to them. We do a fall thing like that. Some of them come back, some of them don't. The biggest thing we've had is the nativity. In the nativity, we've actually got several families that started coming to this church because of the nativity. That's outreach. We're fixing to start Upward Basketball. That's going to start. We're going to start advertising that in the next couple of weeks. It'll start in November. Really, first game will be 1st of January, and go through March. And we're going to try to get all kinds of families from all over Floyd County to come into that gym and play basketball, have a devotion time, and all this stuff. What's my goal? To get them to come to this church. First of all, I want them to know Jesus. But second of all, I'd like them to be members of this church. I'd like people to come here and say, I like this place. Y'all are pretty cool people. And I want to start coming here. And then they start coming here on Sunday morning. That'd be beautiful. That'd be awesome. We're talking about outreach. Does it aggravate you if somebody comes and eats a hot dog at Easter and don't come back? For some people, it may. Now, I'll be honest with you, sometimes I get a little bit put out with it, and I'm like, well, you come eat our food, come back and be with us. But is that really the point? I mean, is the point that we're ministering and we're supposed to, now, if all we do is give them a hot dog, I mean, that's on us, We have to give them the gospel. We have to tell them about Jesus, tell them about the church, and we invite them to come back. And then the ball's in their court. But you see what I'm saying? We put all this work into it. But is it about us, or is it about the people we're trying to reach with the work that we do? That's really what Jesus is talking about in this parable. It's about ourselves and how we go to other people, how we reach out. Now, the first people that were hired, they didn't like this landowner. They said, you treated us unfairly. You gave them other people the same pay we did. Let's just brainstorm. What should have been their response? What is the correct response of the first ones hired? What should they have said? I think they should have said, wow, look at the generosity of this guy. Look how generous he is. Look how great he is. Here's a guy that we work for that hired these people for an hour and paid them the same thing. That is one generous guy. Because it's his money to do with as he pleases. He can do whatever he wants. And he chose to be generous. That's the way it is when we look at the way God operates and God works. Sometimes we got put out by new people that come in and reap the benefits of what we've done. But it should be, man, we serve a really generous God. God is really good. And God does with His grace what God wants to do with His grace. And we should be excited about that. And so you have to ask yourself, is the grace of God really what the Bible says it is? Do we really believe that? Do we really think it's God's unmerited favor towards us? Is God's grace really that great? We sing Amazing Grace and all these kind of songs about God's grace. Do we really believe it's that great? Because if it is, then we like it. Now look at the dialogue immediately before and after this parable. Because immediately before and after, he's talking about self and how we look to ourselves. Matter of fact, look at verse 42. I'm sorry, wrong chapter. Look at verse. I've really lost my place. Look at verse 17. As Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, you know what he's going up to Jerusalem for? It's crucifixion time. As Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves, and on the way he said to them, Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. And will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him, and on the third day he'll be raised up. Here's the reason he said that, on the heels of this parable. He told this parable about examining ourselves and how we react to God's grace, really, how God treats people. And then he says, brings all his disciples in and says, we're going to go to Jerusalem, they will crucify me. Why did he say that? Because you and I, without the context of the cross, we can't understand what grace is. Grace means nothing to us outside the cross. Jesus died for us to give us grace, and with that context, we know it. So, and you've heard this phrase before, we're all level at the foot of the cross. There's nobody any better than anybody else. Everybody's the same. For example, somebody comes in this church Sunday morning and says, I love it, I feel the Spirit, I want to join this church. I want to be a member here. All right? And then, let's say Sunday night, that same Sunday night, we have a conference. They get the same one vote that everybody else gets. Just because they're new doesn't mean you have to wait a while. They get the same decision making as everybody else. Because we're all level at the foot of the cross. We're all equal in this. That's really what he's talking about. That you can't think that you're better than somebody else. And it challenges really those notions of our own superiority and how we think that we may have earned something, or we're better than somebody else. Now, let me close this whole study on the parables and just talk about this. Let me give you some reasons why Jesus taught in parables. Number one, Jesus was an itinerant preacher, and he's what we call an open air preacher. All right, so Jesus didn't have a church. He's walking around, he's teaching on the hillside, he's teaching from boats, and he's just an open air preacher. So when Jesus is teaching in this open air thing, then his methods had to suit the context. So if he's down at the Sea of Galilee and he's teaching from a boat, what's he probably going to talk about? Fish. Because everybody down there is fishing. If Jesus is over in Capernaum, over at somebody's garden, he's going to talk about tilling the soil and planting seeds, because that's what they know. That's what they're doing. So Jesus is going to tell parables because he's an open-air preacher, and everywhere he goes is different, and everybody that he meets is different, have different occupations, different skill sets, and so he's going to tell stories that meets them where they're at. So that's why he tells parables. Number two, and I'm really glad that I'm not an open-air preacher, because open-air preaching demands that outstanding quality. You have to arrest people's attention very fast. Because if I'm preaching down at the beach, and it's just a crowd gathering around, and I can't get their attention, they're leaving. They're walking on down the beach. I don't have them in a building like this. You come in here, chances of you getting them leaving in the middle is pretty slim. Most people just stay in the end and say, I ain't going back. But on the beach, if I ain't listening to what I'm saying, I'm just going to leave. So Jesus has to tell these stories because he has to get their attention. I mean, he has to be captivating. Number three, he's got to have universal appeal. He's got to appeal to everybody. And so he's going to do it on their terms. Number four, he has for an open air preacher like this, he's got to have a gift of being intelligible quickly. I mean, they got to understand what he's talking about. He's got to get to the point. I don't think Jesus' sermons were lengthy. I think they're pretty short, actually. I think they were to the point. He just, I hate to use the phrase, but he just kind of gets in, gets out, says what he got to say, and then because he hits them what they need. I'd really like to test this one day and go back and dig through some sermons I did 6 months ago and ask you if you remember what I said. But an open air preacher has to have speech that's memorable. They got to remember. And if he just gets up and just starts spouting all these theological terms, they're not going to remember that. But if he's talking about planting seeds or catching a fish, they're going to remember that story. But people remember stories. And so Jesus taught this way because he pretty much had to. That was the way of things. So that's all the parables. That's not all of them. That's all we're going to look at. Any questions about this one or any of the other ones? I will say this, there's other examples of parabolic speech in the New Testament. Things like Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, when Paul says we're a living sacrifice, that's the same type of thing. He's painting you a picture with his word. Hebrews chapter 13, Christ suffered outside the gate. Picture, he gives you a picture with his word. James chapter 2, he says faith without works is dead. So when you think of that, you see the image of a corpse. I mean, he's painting a picture with his word. And so I will say this at the very end. We have responsibilities with these parables. We can't just do with them what we please. We can't just manipulate them and massage them around. And we have to always remember that everything Jesus taught, all these parables, ultimately relate to his road to the cross. That's where they lead. They don't mean anything else except for Jesus going to the cross. And on his way to the cross, he's telling us how to be disciples, how to follow him, how to do what he asks us to do. And really, that's the main thing for us. So, anything else? All right, next week we'll try. I mean, unless y'all have another suggestion, if you have another suggestion, I'm open to it. But I've had several conversations with people lately about different kind of world religions, and I thought, well, that'll be a good time to do it. I know y'all did it here before years ago, but it's always worth repeating, I think. So next week we'll start talking about different world religions, and we'll probably start with the most common ones, I guess. Maybe we'll start with Jehovah's Witness, because that's one we all know and we all talk about. I want to tell you what they believe, and here's kind of my goal in this. I want to tell you what they believe, but I also want to tell you how you can respond to them when they come to see you, when you talk to one of them. Because the goal of this is not just to talk about Jehovah's Witness, but it's how we can lead them to Christ, how we can show them that they're not really in God's Word. So I'm going to try to end every week to tell you how to talk to these people, and maybe we can win some folks. All right, I'm going to sign off with our online crowd. Thank you guys for coming.